This is Kenny Tan. Welcome to Real Estate License in 14 Weeks. This is episode 3 of Starting from Zero, Non-Freehold Estate. If you did not have a chance to watch episode 2, I recommend you watch episode 2 on freehold estate. A non-freehold estate is also known as a leasehold estate. In property sense, there are only two types of properties. A property is either a real property or a personal property. A lease is an interest in real property, also known as chattel real. Therefore, since a lease is not real property, it is a personal property. So for exam purposes, if you're ever asked about lease, if you're wondering whether the correct answer is a real property or personal property for lease, the correct answer is personal property. In terms of a leasehold, usually there are two parties. You have the lessor, who is a landlord, and then you also have a lessee, who is the tenant, and between them there is a tenancy. Now let's talk about leasehold estates. There are 4 types of leasehold estate. Number 1 is what we call an estate for years. Now don't be fooled by the term for years. So some people might be mistaken that an estate for years has to be something that is longer than a year. No, estate for years is just a terminology that we use to describe a fixed term lease. In other words, an estate for years is a tenancy that has a fixed expiration date, a fixed term. For example, if you rent a cabin in Big Bear for 2 weeks, that is a form of estate for years, even though 2 weeks is technically less than a year. It's just the name. Don't be fooled by the name, okay? And the next type of tenancy that we have is called a periodic tenancy, or an estate from period to period. A periodic tenancy can be week by week, month by month, or year by year, although the most common type of periodic tenancy that we see is a month-to-month tenancy, less so a week-to-week tenancy or a year-to-year tenancy. For example, you sign a lease with a tenant for a year, and after the lease expires, both parties did not sign a new lease, but the tenant continues to pay rent as if there is an existing lease. Now, whenever a fixed-term lease expires, even if there was no express agreement between the landlord and the tenant to extend the lease further, but if the landlord accepts the tenant's rent on a monthly basis after the 1-year period, the 1-year tenancy becomes a periodic tenancy, becomes a month-to-month tenancy. While technically, a month-to-month tenancy expires every 30 days, except that it renews on its own as if there was no termination of the lease. So that is the nature of a periodic tenancy. The next tenancy is what we call a tenancy at will. Now, some of you may have kids at home. Now, what kind of tenancy do you have with your kid? Have you ever heard of parents wanting to evict their kids or kids wanting to evict their tenants? Well, I've had the opportunity to be contacted by parents who want to evict their kids. So they come to me and ask me, Kenny, what I should do, what kind of notice do I need to serve? So before I decide what kind of notice to serve on the kid to evict the kid, even though I don't have the pleasure of helping a tenant evict a kid, I need to know what kind of tenancy it is. Now, the unique characteristics of a tenancy at will is that the person who is a tenant does not pay rent, and there is no fixed expiration date. So basically, a tenancy at will gives each other, both the landlord and the tenant, the right to terminate the tenancy at any time without giving any kind of advance notice to the other person. So at will means anytime you wish, you can terminate the tenancy. So it is called a tenancy at will. Now the fourth type of tenancy is called estate as sufferance. When a tenant doesn't vacate the property, in other words, for example, if the landlord and the tenant has a 1-year lease, now after the 1 year expires, now if the tenant continues to occupy the property without paying rent, now in this case, who suffers? The landlord suffers. That's why the easiest way to remember the term estate as sufferance is when the tenant doesn't leave after the lease expires and the tenant doesn't pay rent. So those are the 4 kinds of leasehold estates. Next, we're going to talk about the prerequisite for a valid lease. Essentially, there are 4 to 5 important terms in the lease. Number 1, you got to have the name of the parties, right? So on the lease, you would identify who the landlord is and who the tenant is. Next, you need to have the description of the property. Usually the description is by writing down the address of the property. If you don't have a specific address, such as sometimes there are certain type of property like a vacant land, which may or may not have a property address. You can use the APN number, something to identify the property by. Or you may have a situation where the property is identified in terms of its location. So as long as you have enough description of the premises, you will satisfy the requirement of the law. Next, the third thing that we need to have on a valid lease is the amount of the rent. You cannot have a valid lease without the amount of rent. The amount of rent can be like $500, $1,000 per month, or some amount of rent. On top of that, we also need to identify the time and manner of payment. For example, most leases require the tenant to pay on the first of the month. But there is no law that says the time of payment must be on the first, because time of payment could be any other day agreed on by the party, although the first of the month is a convenient date, but it could be any day of the month. It could be the 10th or 15th or whatever day the party wishes. It's just that first of the month is more convenient. Now, in terms of the manner of payment, usually the lease itself will identify what types of manner of payment. It could be cash, cashier's check, personal check. So these are what we call manner of payment. Sometimes a lease may allow the tenant to do a direct deposit. That's also an acceptable manner of payment. The fourth element would have to do with the term of the lease. Is it a month-to-month? Is it for a year or 2-year lease? 5-year lease. That is what we call term of the lease. Finally, the fifth important element of the lease is, does the lease have to be in writing? Not every lease has to be in writing. Some leases can be oral. Some leases must be in writing. Well, how do you decide if a lease has to be in writing or not? You look at the term of the lease. Any lease that is at least 1 year or longer must be in writing or is not a valid lease. There you have it. 5 elements of a valid lease. Next, we're going to talk about security deposit. So what is security deposit? Security deposit is an advance payment made to the landlord. The landlord will hold the security deposit for the benefit of the tenant. A security deposit is not something that the landlord is entitled to keep. The only time that the landlord is entitled to keep a security deposit is when the tenant has failed to fulfill his obligations, such as payment of rent, such as keeping the property in good repairs. See, when the landlord gives possession to the tenant, if the landlord gives it in clean and good repair condition, the tenant would have to return the property to the landlord in good repairs and in clean condition. So in other words, if the property was dirty or the tenant caused the damage to the property, and the tenant would have to spend its own money out of its own pocket to clean up the place and to make the necessary repair, or else the landlord is entitled to make these repairs or clean up the place and deduct these expenses from the security deposit. There are certain legal limits for the amount of security deposit that the landlord can collect from the tenant. For example, if a property is rented with furniture, this is what we call a furnished lease. A furnished lease, the landlord can collect up to legally 3 months of rent as security deposit. But if it is an unfurnished property that is for rent, the maximum that the landlord can collect is only 2 months rent. Now, sometimes a landlord may require the tenant to pay the last month's rent in advance. Now, this is rather unusual. Now, if a landlord requires a tenant to pay the last month's rent in advance, for example, in a 1-year lease, some landlord may require the tenant to pay the 12 months rent in advance. Now, the rent that is paid in advance, even though it is identified as rent, it is technically security deposit. So if a landlord rents out an unfurnished unit and collected 2 months of security deposit, on top of that, requires the tenant to pay the last month's rent. Because the last month's rent is treated as a security deposit, in this case, the landlord had collected 3 months of rent as security deposit, and when the property is not furnished, it is in violation of the law. The last month's rent would have been an illegal security deposit. So that's all I'm going to talk about leases on this episode. On episode 4, I will continue on leases. So if you like my video and if you want to receive first notification of new releases of my videos, please remember to subscribe, and also don't forget to click the bell. That way you'll receive first notification of any new releases.